The Galactic Union's flagship, Solaris, orbited Halcyon Prime like a sentinel of hope and power. Its hull shimmered with adaptive alloy, and its countless weapon systems were primed for immediate engagement. Inside, the ship bustled with soldiers from dozens of species, each clad in advanced armor designed to maximize their unique physiological advantages. The tension aboard was palpable. Halcyon Prime had become a critical battlefield in the Union's war against the Vraxis Collective, a ruthless empire of insectoid invaders whose conquests left desolation in their wake. The Vraxis had turned the planet into a fortress, their burrowing technologies creating a network of impenetrable strongholds. Every attempt to dislodge them had failed spectacularly, costing the Union untold lives. Amid the chaos and urgency of war preparations, an odd figure disembarked from a shuttle that had just docked in the hangar. Clad in weather fatigues and carrying an antiquated rifle slung over his shoulder, Staff Sergeant Daniel Old Man Carter stepped onto the deck. The hangar was a sprawling expanse of advanced engineering, filled with shimmering plasma fighters and towering mech suits. As Carter walked through, heads turned. Alien soldiers of every shape and size paused their tasks to stare, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright mockery. "Is that what on his weapon?" a feline Arcturian asked, her whiskers twitching in disbelief. "No enhancements," scoffed a towering Trillian, his skin glowing faintly as bioluminescent patches flickered in amusement. "What century is this human from?" Carter ignored them, his grizzled face set in a mask of calm indifference. At 62 years old, he was a relic by military standards. His hair was silver, his face lined with the scars of decades-long service, and his back slightly bent from years of carrying gear and responsibility. In contrast to the sleek cybernetic soldiers around him, he was an anomaly, a man armed with nothing more than experience and an old bolt-action sniper rifle. As he passed a group of Elorian engineers, one of them, his translucent skin pulsing with light, couldn't resist a jibe. "Hey, Grandpa, did you take a wrong turn on your way to the History Museum?" The hangar erupted in laughter, but Carter didn't even glance in their direction. He was used to it. He'd heard it all before, on Earth, in the Union training camps, and every deployment since humanity had joined this interstellar alliance. To the galaxy's technologically advanced species, he was an anachronism, a man hopelessly out of place in a war defined by plasma rifles, drone swarms, and artificial intelligence. Carter made his way to the command deck, where the Union senior officers were gathered. The briefing room was a stark contrast to the chaotic hangar, quiet, tense, and filled with holographic displays projecting tactical data and maps of Halcyon Prime. General Kale, the Trillian commander, presided over the meeting. His 7-foot-tall frame and shimmering blue skin made him an imposing figure, and his every word carried the weight of authority. Around the table sat other senior officers, including Commander Jin, an Arcturian with predatory eyes and a sleek, muscular build, and Captain Vera, an Elorian strategist whose glowing form flickered as he adjusted a hologram. Carter entered quietly, standing near the back of the room. He wasn't invited to speak. His presence was merely a formality, a nod to humanity's participation in the Union. The senior officers barely acknowledged him as they debated the situation. The Vraxis command center is buried deep within the ironclad mountains. Kale began, pointing to a pulsating red marker on the hologram. It's shielded by a quantum barrier that renders orbital strikes useless. Any ground assault we've attempted has been repelled with heavy losses. Their anti-air defenses are too strong for a direct drop, added Commander Jin, her voice sharp. Every fighter we send into that sector gets torn apart before it can deploy troops. Captain Vera leaned forward, his bioluminescent eyes glowing brighter. Then we must consider alternative strategies. Sabotage, perhaps, or a diversion to draw their forces away. The room was filled with murmurs as the officers debated. Carter stood silently, his sharp eyes scanning the holographic map. He noticed something the others had overlooked, a narrow mountain pass that led to a high ridge overlooking the Vraxis command center. It was a perilous route, but it offered a line of sight to the heart of the enemy's stronghold. Finally, he spoke. "There's another way." The room fell silent, and dozens of eyes turned toward him. General Kale frowned, his expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "And what would that be, Sergeant?" Carter stepped forward, tapping the hologram to highlight the ridge. "From here, I can see the command center. Let me take the shot." The officers stared at him in disbelief. "You—" Commander Jint's tail lashed behind her in irritation. "With that antique weapon of yours? That's absurd." General Kale folded his arms. "Even if you could reach the ridge, the distance to the command center is extreme. No weapon in our arsenal can make that shot with the necessary precision." Carter unslung his rifle, setting it on the table. Its wooden stock and polished barrel gleamed under the room's sterile lighting. "This can—" Laughter erupted around the table. Captain Vera, who had remained silent until now, tilted his head curiously. "You're serious," he said, more a statement than a question. "Dead serious," Carter replied. "That shot's a little over 2 kilometers. I've made longer. Give me the chance, and I'll take out their commander." General Kale's frown deepened. "And what makes you think their forces will fall apart if you succeed? These are the Vraxis. They're not known for their reliance on individual leaders. They're hive-minded," Carter said. "But even a hive needs a queen. Take her out and the rest scatter. It's not about the weapon. It's about the strategy." Kale exchanged glances with the other officers. The skepticism in the room was palpable, but beneath it was a hint of desperation. Every other strategy had failed. "You're asking us to risk an operation on the skills of a man with no enhancements, no support, and no backup," Kale said. "Why should we trust you?" Carter met the general's gaze, his voice calm and steady. "Because I've been doing this longer than anyone here has been alive. I just need one shot." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Kale sighed. "Very well, Sergeant. You'll have your chance. But don't expect a rescue if you fail. You'll be on your own." Carter nodded. "That's how I prefer it." As the meeting ended, the officers dispersed, leaving Carter alone with his rifle. He ran his hand over the weapon's smooth surface, the familiar weight grounding him. Out in the hangar, the mocking voices of the Galactic soldiers still echoed, but Carter didn't hear them. He was already focused on the mission ahead. The barren surface of Halcyon Prime stretched out before Carter as he stepped off the dropship. The landscape was a grim testament to the war's intensity. Ashen gray plains pockmarked with craters, jagged mountains looming in the distance, and the faint hum of energy shields crackling on the horizon. The air was thin, laced with traces of sulfur, and the ground beneath his boots crunched like shattered bone. The dropship's engines roared as it lifted off, leaving him alone in the desolate wasteland. Carter adjusted his pack, shifted the rifle on his shoulder, and set his gaze on the distant ridge. The path ahead would be treacherous, but he'd faced worse in his long career. As he trudged forward, the weight of his mission settled on him. The Galactic Union's survival hinged on this single operation. If he succeeded, the Vraxis command structure would collapse, giving the Union forces a fighting chance. If he failed, Halcyon Prime, and likely the Union itself, would fall. The ridge was over 6 kilometers away, but the terrain made the journey far more challenging. Carter moved cautiously, sticking to shadows and using the uneven ground for cover. The Vraxis were known for their advanced surveillance systems, and even a moment of carelessness could reveal his position. The perils of the path. Hours into the trek, Carter encountered his first obstacle, a patrol of Vraxis drones hovering low over the ground. The insectoid machines, with their serrated legs and pulsating red sensors, swept the area methodically. Their metallic bodies gleamed under the harsh sunlight, and their movements were unervingly precise. Carter crouched behind a boulder, his rifle steady in his hands. He watched their patterns, calculating their timing. When the nearest drone paused to skin a cluster of rocks, Carter exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, the sound sharp and distinct in the still air. The drone sensor shattered, and it collapsed in a heap of sparking metal. Before the others could react, Carter had already moved, weaving through the rocks and taking out the remaining machines with clinical efficiency. As the final drone crumpled to the ground, Carter inspected the wreckage. The Vrax's technology was advanced, but their reliance on predictable patrol patterns made them vulnerable. He smiled faintly, his weathered face creasing. "Overthinkers," he muttered. The encounter reinforced his resolve. Every step he took, every obstacle he overcame, brought him closer to the ridge and to the target that awaited him there. Memories of another time. As Carter climbed higher into the mountains, his mind wandered to memories of Earth. He'd grown up in a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone. His father had taught him to hunt in the dense forest surrounding their home, and it was there that Carter had first learned the patience and precision that defined his skill as a marksman. He remembered the smell of the woods after a rainstorm, the weight of the rifle in his hands, and the sense of accomplishment when he brought down his first deer. Those days felt like another lifetime now, a distant echo of a simpler world. His thoughts turned to his family. His wife, Sarah, had passed years ago, and his children were grown, scattered across Earth and beyond. Joining the Galactic Union had been his way of staying useful, of proving that even in his later years, he could still contribute. Carter's lips tightened. The young soldiers who mocked him didn't understand. They thought war was about technology, about having the latest gear and enhancements. But Carter knew better. War was about willpower, about making the hard decisions when everything was on the line. And now, everything was on the line, the ridge in sight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Carter finally reached the base of the ridge. The climb ahead was steep, the rocky terrain offering little in the way of handholds. He took a moment to rest, pulling a ration bar from his pack and scanning the area with his binoculars. The Vrax's command center lay far below, its hive-like structure glowing faintly with energy. Through his scope, Carter could see the defenses surrounding it. Plasma turrets, shield generators, and squads of insectoid soldiers patrolling the perimeter. He adjusted the focus, searching for his target. Inside the central chamber of the hive, he spotted Overlord Crixif. The Vrax's leader was an imposing figure, towering over her subordinates with an armored exoskeleton that shimmered like black glass. Her mandibles clicked as she issued orders, her multifaceted eyes glowing with intelligence and menace. Carter's heart quickened. This was it, the culmination of decades of training and experience. But first, he had to reach the ridge. The final ascent. The climb was grueling. Carter's muscles burned with effort, and the thin air made every breath a struggle. He moved methodically, testing each handhold and foothold before committing his weight. Loose rocks tumbled away into the darkness below, a stark reminder of the consequences of a single misstep. Halfway up, a sudden noise froze him in place. The faint hum of a Vrax's drone echoed through the mountains. Carter pressed himself flat against the rock face, his body blending into the shadows. The drone passed overhead, its red sensor scanning the ridge. Carter waited until the sound faded, then continued his climb. His movements were slow, deliberate, every ounce of energy focused on reaching the top. When he finally pulled himself onto the ridge, he lay still for a moment, catching his breath. The view was breathtaking and deadly. The command center was a glowing beacon in the valley below, its defenses a testament to the Vrax's technological prowess. But none of that mattered now. Carter set up his rifle, planting the bipod firmly in the rocky ground. He adjusted the scope, calibrating for the extreme distance, the wind speed, and the planet's unique atmospheric conditions. He exhaled slowly, his body settling into a state of perfect stillness. The weight of the moment. As he peered through the scope, time seemed to slow. Carter's world narrowed to the crosshairs, and the faint glow of Crixita's form in the distance. He could see the Overlord pacing in the central chamber, her mandibles twitching as she barked orders. This was the shot that would decide the fate of the war. Carter's finger rested lightly on the trigger. He took a deep breath, held it, and focused every fiber of his being on the target. In that moment, he wasn't a relic or an old man. He was a sniper, a hunter, and a soldier. The ridge was silent, save for the faint whistle of the wind curling through the jagged rocks. Carter lay prone, his rifle braced firmly against his shoulder. His breathing slowed, becoming almost imperceptible, as he peered through the scope at his target far below. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he welcomed it. Pressure was a companion he had grown accustomed to over the years. In the hive-like structure below, Overlord Crixus stood in the command chamber. Her towering figure dominated the room, her multifaceted eyes glowing a fiery red as she orchestrated her forces. Carter studied her movements, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The scope's reticle hovered over her chitinous torso, just above where her heart would be. He adjusted for the 2-kilometer distance, factoring in wind speed, elevation, and Halcyon Prime's slightly thinner atmosphere. The calculations were second nature to him, ingrained from decades of experience. The Galactic Union had given him this chance, reluctantly, and now he had to prove them wrong. He had to show them that skill, patience, and resolve could trump even the most advanced technologies. He exhaled slowly, his finger tightening on the trigger. Then he fired. The moment of impact. The rifle's crack split the air, echoing through the mountains like a thunderclap. The recoil jolted Carter's shoulder, but his body absorbed it effortlessly. Through the scope, he watched as the bullet traveled, a tiny, near-invisible streak cutting through the distance. In the command chamber below, Overlord Crixus paused mid-sentence, her mandibles clicking in confusion. A split second later, the bullet struck, shattering the armored plating over her chest and piercing her heart. Her eyes flickered, the red glow dimming as a shrill, chittering cry escaped her mandibles. She collapsed, her massive form crumpling to the ground. The Vraxis officers around her froze, their hive-mind connection momentarily disrupted. Carter didn't linger to watch the aftermath. He chambered another round, scanning the hive for secondary targets. The Vraxis forces were in chaos, their once-coordinated movements devolving into frantic disarray. Without Crixus's command, the hive mind's precision was faltering. In that instant, Carter knew he had done it. The counterattack. The sound of the shot carried far, alerting the Vraxis forces patrolling the mountains. A shrill alarm echoed through the valley, and Carter spotted movement below. Drones and insectoid soldiers were converging on the ridge, their sharp, angular bodies glinting in the moonlight. "Time to move," Carter muttered, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He grabbed his pack and began descending the opposite side of the ridge. The terrain was steep and treacherous, but Carter moved with practiced efficiency. Behind him, the hum of drones grew louder, their searchlights sweeping the mountainside. He ducked into a narrow crevice, his body pressed against the cold stone as a drone passed overhead. He glanced at his watch. The Galactic Union would have received the signal by now. Their forces would be mobilizing, exploiting the chaos his shot had caused. But his mission wasn't over yet. He still had to survive. The chase. The Vraxis were relentless. Their drones scoured the mountains with surgical precision, and squads of soldiers fanned out, their chittering communication echoing through the night. Carter moved like a shadow, using every ounce of his training to stay one step ahead. At one point, he found himself cornered in a narrow ravine. A trio of Vraxis soldiers approached, their bioplasma rifles glowing ominously. Carter crouched behind a boulder, his hand gripping his sidearm. As the first soldier rounded the corner, Carter fired, the sharp crack of his pistol shattering the quiet. The Vraxis fell, its body convulsing as green ichor spilled onto the ground. Carter didn't hesitate, taking out the second soldier with a well-placed shot to the head. The third soldier lunged at him, its serrated limbs slashing through the air. Carter sidestepped, drawing his combat knife in one swift motion. He plunged the blade into the soldier's neck, twisting as the creature let out a wet, gurgling screech. Panting, Carter wiped the blade on his fatigues and continued moving. Every second counted. A narrow escape. Dawn was beginning to break when Carter finally reached the extraction point, a narrow plateau overlooking a vast canyon. He activated his distress beacon, sending a signal to the Solaris. The beacon's blue light pulsed rhythmically, a tiny beacon of hope in the vast wilderness. But the Vraxis weren't far behind. The hum of drones grew louder, and Carter could see them closing in. He set up his rifle, using the last of his ammunition to pick off the nearest threats. The first drone exploded in a shower of sparks, its remains tumbling into the canyon below. The second veered off course as Carter's bullet shattered its propulsion system. But there were too many. As the drones swarmed closer, Carter heard the roar of engines above. He looked up to see a Union dropship descending, its weapons blazing. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, cutting down the advancing Vraxis forces. The dropship landed, its ramp lowering. A squad of Galactic soldiers emerged, their sleek armor glinting in the morning light. "Sergeant Carter," one of them shouted. "Let's go." Carter didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the dropship, ducking as plasma fire whizzed past him. He felt the heat of an explosion as a drone detonated nearby, the shockwave nearly knocking him off his feet. But he kept moving. The soldiers covered him, their weapons laying down suppressive fire. As Carter reached the ramp, a Trillian soldier grabbed his arm, hauling him aboard. The dropship lifted off, the Vraxis forces below shrinking into insignificance. The aftermath. Back aboard the Solaris, Carter was met with a mix of silence and awe. The same soldiers who had mocked him now stared in disbelief. The footage of his shot had already spread throughout the fleet, a testament to what one man with a rifle could accomplish. General Kale approached him, his expression uncharacteristically subdued. "You did it," he said. "The Vraxis forces are in complete disarray. We're launching a full-scale assault now. This war might finally turn in our favor." Carter nodded, his face unreadable. "Glad I could help." Kale extended a hand. "You've earned more than that, Sergeant. You've earned respect. Not just for yourself, but for your people." Carter shook the general's hand, his grip firm. He didn't need accolades or recognition. He'd done what needed to be done. That was enough. As he returned to his quarters, the weight of the mission finally lifted. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself a small smile. The Solaris hummed with a new kind of energy. Word of Sergeant Daniel, old man, Carter's impossible shot had spread through the fleet like wildfire. Holographic displays replayed the event on every deck. Soldiers gathered in awe, dissecting every detail of the 2-kilometer strike that had turned the tide of the war. But Carter paid no attention to the chatter. He sat quietly in a corner of the mess hall, sipping a steaming cup of synthetic coffee. His old rifle leaned against the table beside him, a silent reminder of his victory. A group of young soldiers passed by, their gazes flickering toward him with a mix of admiration and hesitation. One of them, an Arcturian with striking silver fur, broke away from the group and approached. "Sergeant Carter," she said, her voice tinged with both respect and disbelief. Carter looked up, his weathered face calm. "Yeah." She hesitated, her feline eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile the legend with the man before her. "How did you make that shot?" "No enhancements, no targeting systems, just that old rifle." Carter smiled faintly, tapping the side of his head. "This," he said, "and a lot of practice." The soldier nodded slowly, her expression shifting to one of awe. "You saved us all. Thank you." Carter nodded in return, but he said nothing. As she walked away, he returned to his coffee, his thoughts already moving to the next challenge. The Union's counteroffensive. The Vraxis forces on Halcyon Prime were in chaos. Without Overlord Crixit to guide them, their hive-mind coordination faltered, and their formidable defenses crumbled. The Galactic Union launched a massive assault, their forces descending on the planet like a storm. From the observation deck of the Solaris, Carter watched as Union dropships streaked toward the surface. Fighters darted through the skies, their plasma cannons lighting up the battlefield below. Explosions rippled across the Vrax's strongholds, their once impenetrable fortifications reduced to rubble. General Kale stood beside Carter, his arms folded as he surveyed the battle. "Your shot made this possible," he said, his deep voice carrying a rare note of admiration. Carter shrugged. "Just one piece of the puzzle, General. It takes an army to win a war." Kale turned to him, his glowing blue eyes serious. "Don't downplay it. You didn't just take out a leader, you shattered their morale. The Vraxes are retreating across every front. This war is finally tipping in our favor." Carter said nothing, his gaze fixed on the planet below. He wasn't one for speeches or self-congratulation. The mission was what mattered, and it wasn't over until the last soldier came home. A new enemy emerges. Despite the overwhelming success of the Union's assault, Carter couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was wrong. The Vraxes were ruthless and relentless, but their retreat was too sudden, too complete. It felt orchestrated. His instincts were confirmed when an emergency alert blared across the Solaris. A holographic display materialized in the command center, showing a massive Vraxis warship emerging from hyperspace. The ship was unlike anything the Union had encountered before, monolithic and pulsing with an eerie green light. "Identification?" General Kale barked, his voice sharp. "Unknown," replied an officer. "It's broadcasting Vraxis signals, but the energy readings are off the scale." The warship loomed over Halcyon Prime like a dark omen, its hull bristling with weapons. As the Union fleet scrambled to respond, the ship unleashed a devastating energy beam that obliterated a cluster of Union cruisers in a single strike. The command center erupted in chaos. Officers shouted orders, tactical displays lit up with warnings, and the tension was palpable. Carter watched silently, his mind already working. This wasn't a random act of desperation. The Vraxis had a plan, and this ship was the centerpiece. The call to action. General Kale turned to Carter, his expression grim. "Sergeant, I don't suppose you have another miracle shot in you?" Carter smirked. "Not from this distance." Kale nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll need to get you closer." Within minutes, Carter was suiting up in the armory. Unlike the sleek, high-tech gear favored by the Union soldiers, his equipment was simple and practical. He checked his rifle, running a hand over the polish with stock, and secured his sidearm and knife. A young Elorian soldier approached, holding out a small device. "This is a targeting module," he said nervously. "It's not as advanced as the ones we use, but it should help with—" Carter raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need it." The soldier hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. As Carter boarded the dropship, the crew saluted him, their expressions a mix of respect and hope. He didn't dwell on it. His focus was on the mission ahead, the final battle. The dropship weaved through a storm of enemy fire, its engines screaming as it dodged plasma bursts and missile salvos. Carter sat silently in the hold, his rifle across his lap. The plan was simple. Infiltrate the Vraxis warship and disable its core. The ship shuddered as it breached the enemy's defenses, slamming into a hangar bay with a deafening crash. Carter and a small team of Union soldiers poured out, weapons at the ready. The interior of the Vraxis ship was a nightmare of organic metallic architecture. Walls pulsed with a sickly green light, and the air was thick with an acrid metallic tang. The team moved quickly, navigating the labyrinthine corridors toward the core. Vraxis soldiers swarmed to intercept them, their screeches echoing through the halls. The Union soldiers fought fiercely, plasma fire illuminating the darkness. Carter picked his shots carefully, each pull of the trigger sending another enemy crashing to the floor. As they neared the core chamber, the resistance intensified. The Vraxis seemed to realize the threat Carter posed, focusing their attacks on him. But he was unshakable, his rifle an extension of his will. Finally, they reached the core, a massive, pulsating sphere of energy suspended in the center of the chamber. It was protected by a field of interlocking shields, and dozens of Vraxis soldiers guarded it. Carter assessed the situation, his mind racing. The core's weak point was at the very top, where the energy conduits converged. It was a nearly impossible shot, difficult even for him. But nearly impossible wasn't the same as impossible. The second shot. Carter took cover behind a column, steadying his rifle. The battlefield around him dissolved into a blur as he focused on the target. His breathing slowed, his body stilling. One shot. That was all he needed. He pulled the trigger. The bullet streaked through the air, piercing the shield at just the right angle and striking the core's weak point. The sphere shuddered violently, cracks spreading across its surface. A blinding explosion followed, the shockwave ripping through the chamber. Carter was thrown backward, slamming into the wall. When the light faded, the core was gone, and the warship was collapsing. The Legacy, back on the Solaris, Carter was hailed as a hero once more. The destruction of the Vraxis warship marked the beginning of the end for their empire. The Galactic Union's victory was inevitable now. But Carter didn't stay for the celebrations. He retreated to his quarters, his rifle resting beside him. He was a soldier, and his job was done. The galaxy would remember him as the man who turned the tide, not once, but twice. But for Carter, it wasn't about glory. It was about doing what needed to be done,